All right, we might get started. On behalf of Fintech Australia, I would like to welcome you to our payments review webinar with Scott Farrell and the chair of Fintech Australia, Simone Joyce. If I don't speak for myself, I definitely would like to say that I think the payment system review, Scott, was the most anticipated review of the year, even more so than the future directions report and CDR, and the attendee numbers already online go to show that. I'll be very brief and I'll hand over to Simone, who will moderate today's conversation, but I encourage all the audience to ask questions and definitely participate in the conversation, and I'll come back to you when we're finished. Thanks, bye.
Thanks, Beck. Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you all online this morning. And Scott, it's lovely to see you again. I echo Beck's sentiments around the anticipation around this report. And I must say, I really enjoyed reading it. Really happy that you could take the time out this morning to come and talk us through and give us some more detail around some of the elements of the report. And I'm going to let you actually talk about some of the consideration that went into writing it and how you actually approached the construction of such a significant packet of recommendations with so many different stakeholders and so many different opinions and requirements. So I'll hand over to you in a moment. As we go through, after Scott's given us an overview of the writing of the report itself, I'll ask some questions that we've actually collated from some of the pre-submitted questions and some of the questions that I had myself. And if we have time, we'll go and grab some other questions that you might think of as we're going through this morning. Just pop them in the chat. Don't feel you need to raise your hand or interrupt. If you pop them in the chat, I'll pick them up if we have some time at the end. But now I'll hand over to Scott and I'll pop myself on mute until you need me to come back off again. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Simone. And can I start by saying thank you very much to Fintech Australia for the submissions and the conversations that we had as part of this review. It is a very poorly kept secret that I'm not very clever at all, and I just really rely on the intelligence and commitment of everyone that provides me submissions. And Fintech Australia's was excellent. And so thank you for that. Please don't stop. I would say that if you do reflect on the reforms over the last half a decade, please keep in mind how much Fintech Australia has contributed to those, because you can't stop contributing or the reform will stop. So thank you. It was my third review that I've led. I do help in other reviews, but that was the third one that I had led. And it was a broader ecosystem. It was also a review for the first time, which was actually in an area of the law, which I'd practiced for more than a quarter of a century. So I actually did know one or two things in this area. But what was interesting about that is it was already evident that what we had as a regulatory framework was old. During the review, I spoke with a number of countries. I tend to speak to them a lot now, governments and regulators in other countries. And it was also clear that we were older than everyone else. We were once the first to do these sorts of things, but it was certainly time to look at this. It was also clear that some of the issues that were developing in relation to payments regulation were issues because we had lost a functional approach to what we were trying to regulate. Made perfect sense. When our current regulatory regime was put into place, it was a banking payment system. The storage of value and the liquidity of value were forever connected, because that's the way it was for the previous 300 years. Now, those two functions are separate, but the actual regulatory framework we have has really just had things added onto it, rather than a full upgrade as to just a second, what are we doing here? Nearly everyone that I spoke to, and I spoke to lots of people from all sorts of backgrounds, Simone, much more varied than normal, recognised that fact. And there was, though, of course, a cacophony of voices saying, I want this, I want that, I want this, I want that. And what the interesting thing is, when you distilled down why they were asking for those things as opposed to what they were asking for, there was a lot of commonality. And keep in mind, of course, this report was not about any particular payment system, and it wasn't about the services provided. It was actually about the regulatory and, as a result, the legal framework which sits underneath them. So what were those things that we found as a matter of principle? We found that, well, there's 4 things which are important in our payments regulation. The first one is it should be there to serve. It should be there to serve the people who want to buy and sell things or transfer money, and the businesses that want to sell or buy things and transfer money. And actually, as we look this regulation and what we want to do, we must keep in mind it's only for that purpose, because payments has got so arcane and complex that sometimes people involved in payments forget their whole reason for living is just so real people can buy and sell things. And we need to get back to that, because that's the functional approach that allows us to consider the incredible complexity that technology will bring us over the next 10 years. And indeed, part of the point of the review is not just to solve the problems of the present, but to give us a chance at solving the problems of the future that we can't yet predict. The second part of it was strategy, as to where are we going with our payments regulation, and where do we want payments in Australia to be? Not in the sense of dictating business models, that's never part of the gig, but in the sense of businesses and fintechs and startups will need some kind of certainty to invest into, not just reaction. So and indeed, you can see a similar recommendation popping up in my future, the CDR review. It's exactly the same context. In fact, there's a lot of commonality between valuable information in the form of data and valuable information in the form of money, and they do need to be considered together. The point of strategy is, well, it's hard to find our overall strategy for payments regulation. There's so much changing, so what's the plan? So that was, although service was reasonable, although some small businesses were starting to worry that they actually couldn't get the access to payments they needed to buy and sell things, on strategy, pretty much everyone said, we haven't had one for a while. Individual industry bodies do, but actually as a whole. The next one was simplicity. Not because payments should be simple, they're hard, but for people who use them or people who want to actually offer services in them, you shouldn't have to be hit with the full complexity of the international payment system in order to start your first business, to sell your first thing, or to buy something. And the clearest example of that was the licensing framework, which was too hard. If you need to pay for a lawyer to work out if you need a license to start a business, that's called too hard. The last of the 4 things is safety. Now, that's usually where everyone starts. We didn't have to start with that because it's so good in this country on day-to-day payments. I mean that in the context of all the other governments that I was working with. It's a given. It must always be a given. But we can walk and chew gum, right? So it doesn't just have to be always about safety. We build better roads. They're as safe as older roads. We can build a better regulatory framework. So those 4 things we were using as a benchmark, and those 4 things are still with Treasury now, as to most importantly, who are we doing this for? Where are we going to next? How easy should it be? And then what if something goes wrong? Those 4 principles effectively I was using to shuffle all the points that people were giving us. Now, where did they lead to? They led to 3 streams of recommendations. Fortunately, this time around, guys, there's only 15 recommendations. I think it's about 126 pages. It's a lot easier to read than my last one because I was asked a very, very different question this time. So what are the 3 things? There is recommendations relating to policy. They are things like, well, where's that plan? Who's going to write that plan? Who's in charge of this thing? In fact, if all of the regulators, all 5 of them, are on a playing field, where's the coach? We need a coach. And in particular, we need a coach to change the game when the field changes. Sometimes I wonder if we're playing football on an Aussie rules field sometimes, because the field just keeps changing on this thing. Plus, really importantly, actually this public sector team can't do this on its own. We need another 5 players from the private sector team like now, because something like a CBDC has turned up on the opposition side and we don't know how to deal with that. I'll try and stick away from the football analogy now, Simone. I can get carried away. And in fact, during the review, it got so convoluted because so many people just kept giving us new analogies as to who the physio was on the team, who carried the water on the team. Don't send those through, right? We've got nearly all of the ones we can handle. So the policy point is about the coordination. And the next point down is the regulatory point. Okay, we understand that we need some guidance as to how the players are going to play. Now, are we going to make sure they actually play the same game on this team? And this is the question a bit further down. It gets to, right, okay, what is a payment? Because what we had from 20 years ago as a definition is not a payment anymore. It's just part of a payment. And I don't want, of course, the law to govern business, but the law should at least catch up and actually act as a foundation for business ideas to be developed. Also, that idea of what a payment means, which is very relevant if you need a license to provide services, is also relevant to if you're looking at how do we keep the systems safe. And so in the report, I distinguished between payment systems and payment services, only really to work out what kind of tools we might use to protect essentially that mums and dads and everyone else can be sure that they can move the money necessary or transfer the value needed to get the stuff they want or need. And in relation to that, probably one of the biggest items was the introduction of a new designation power to say, actually, we need to bring this into our regulatory net. And that could be for reasons that aren't currently covered in our current regulatory systems, like national sovereignty, like data-related issues, like cybersecurity issues, like all of the things that those of us involved in payments kind of worry about in the middle of the night, because we realize that, quite frankly, technology and money are nearly identical now. So all of these issues that we see in technology, won't they happen to money as well? And on whose watch should that be? And so a large part of the regulation as well, we need a Treasury team, as we said before. The Treasury and the Treasury team need a designation power so they can catch things, so that they're not going to fall between the gaps of the different players. And we do need to align those players with the strategy, because some of these threats could be real. One step down to stuff that people on this call probably are really concerned or interested in, the licensing. So the licensing regime at the moment is convoluted. It is, it's as if, I suspect every single step that was made in adjusting the requirements for licensing with each of the regulators was probably sensible at the time it was made. But when you stand back and look at it, you go, wow, like, did that what we really wanted to build? Did anyone think this was the design that we were building here? Because I think we've got Lego blocks from different sets and we're mixing them up completely here. So in addition to that alignment, we need also for it to be a simple interface. And so what I've recommended is a single licensing concept, which connects to accreditation for CDR, assuming payment initiation will be added to CDR, in which case it better connect, because that's actually just part of the same continuum. And on the far end, if you want to grow your business a long way, a bank. But there's got to be something in between. And it's more than one thing. The thing in between has to be a license which handles, subtle enough to handle, some people will be offering liquidity of value and some people will be offering storage of value. There are different risks for those. So don't impose storage of value regulation on someone doing liquidity and vice versa. You could do both. That's cool. Also, you could be small or big. And the difference between small or big is, if you're big and you're doing something like liquidity of value, the Reserve Bank might be interested to make sure you don't blow up the financial system. If you're doing storage of value, APRA might be interested to make sure that you're going to make sure everyone gets their money back. Do you need to impose that on people who have a smaller impact? No, you don't. And so ASIC is the front door. ASIC will be supported by those other regulators if you're going for a bigger license. That happens already if you're a clearing system, by the way, that we've been using that method for 21 years. In fact, for clearing systems, having the other regulators effectively playing behind the first player. And that larger license also will need to adhere with industry standards. Now, one of the cues here is clearly, as these standards are developed, organisations like Fintech Australia really need to be involved in that. Probably, I don't know how many years ago, I spoke to you guys about my first open banking review, and I asked you desperately, please don't leave this here. I've just really set up the ball for you guys to play. You've got to step into it. And because you can't count on the government making sure that this all gets to where you need it to be. This is an example of that too. Certainly an important part of the licensing function with the standards is the involvement of the private sector in this, and indeed to make sure that this works. And when I say work, I don't mean work legally. They can do that. To make sure it works for you, you're going to have to make sure you remain part of the conversation. I am conscious that you're already busy running businesses, but no one can make sure the regulation works as well for your business as you can. Two other parts of that, which I'm sure I'll get questions on, is actually in relation to that licensing, the e-payments code needs to actually become part of the regulatory framework, like it does in nearly every other country that you might be running a business in. In fact, the most common comment I got from other governments and regulators was, what, really? It's not even law there? So, yeah, well, don't tell anyone, okay, because we do seem to be a long way behind by not having any legal right for customers to get their money back in these circumstances. And the other one is actually part of this single licensing regime should mean that we do not need to keep proving the same thing over and over again for different regulators, including, for example, if we've got the data security stuff handled because of CDR accreditation, don't ask for it again. Like, can't you just rely on what we've already got? But also part of that is actually some of these obligations we have satisfy requirements that payment systems ask for us to satisfy if we want to join them. Can we please have that carried over? In fact, actually for the large license, the large payments facilitation license, can we just have some things that are the baseline for what is required to be safe, efficient and fair in a payment system, so we can then identify what a payment system is asking for beyond those requirements. And quite frankly, to make sure that they are the best requirements and people can't question them when we have them, we'll get the Reserve Bank to tell us what they should be. And so this idea of being able to use what you've proven as you move up this licensing chain for multiple tasks is really important. It doesn't mean that you could necessarily join every payment system, but if you have that license and you meet those standards, then you shouldn't be challenged on whether you meet the requirements that those standards are supposed to apply to. So the idea behind that is single license. Let's embed these things in them so you're required to have them as your risk profile says so. You could actually choose to meet these standards earlier. And if you meet them, they should be usable for other parts of our payment system and our regulatory framework and our information regulatory framework, so that the one license and its attributes can be used multiple times. Going back to that point I made earlier, you shouldn't need to keep going back to lawyers in relation to meeting regulatory issues. There should be a pathway for doing it. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. If you're going to run a payment system that has lots of customers and lots of value, there are standards you need to meet, but it's unfair to ask a smaller entity to meet those, and it's unfair to ask you to meet them multiple times when you've already proven you can meet them once. So I'm sure they've got lots of questions there, but what I've tried to articulate are the 4 areas of what we were looking at, and then the 3 streams of recommendations that got there. I haven't touched every single recommendation. But Simone, I'm sure the questions will get onto the ones that people care about.
Thank you. That was a very good summary. And thank goodness you had, what did you say, 25 years experience in this field before you sat down to write this report, because it is quite complex and it's not a green field. CDR was a little bit more greenfield so that you could, I guess, have more creativity without legacy issues to deal with. So this was a little bit more nuanced, I think. So, okay, great. Look, the first question, you kind of set this up a little bit in talking about where fintech has a place. I'd really like to know where you think, if you could pick us up and put fintech as an industry representative, representing all of our members, a lot on this call today, with great plans and really great ideas about shaping this new future. Where would you put our representatives in this regulatory landscape? Would you put us in multiple places? Would you put us in one? Would the convener that you've identified to be almost the advisor to the treasurer be fintech friendly? Would they have a fintech advisor talking to them specifically about fintech issues? What do you think would be the most effective place or places?
I should rush to add, I am not the convener, by the way. So
well, I kind of wish you would be.
I didn't create a report to give myself another job. That would be very bad form. But it's a really good point. And if that convener, the convener idea, which I tested with governments around the world too, because they had the same problem that we do, is that when you create a council or a committee, quite often everyone works hard to get onto the committee or council, and then they just stop and drink coffee and have biscuits from that point on. I'm not commenting on anyone in particular, but certainly that's what I've done when I've got onto these things sometimes. Phew, I've got there, now I don't need to do anything. No, actually, what we want is we want people to be as engaged as they are in these reviews. We want them to actually see change, not see change, SEE change, and then keep pushing it forward. So what does that mean? The first thing is you should not drop any of your connections with the individual regulators. That's clearly important. And they just won't be quite of the same strategic level as they might be now, because strategy has effectively been lifted up. You certainly would want to have good, in fact, very good connectivity with the new Treasury team that I've recommended being created. I certainly would imagine that Treasury team would be created out of parts of my secretariat who you're already connected with. But the reason for their existence in part of this is because they are not a regulator, which means that you can tell them things and they're not going to immediately think, has a law been broken? That's not their gig. Their gig is to fix it up. You'd want to do that. The convener does need to be everyone friendly, including fintech friendly. And so that is important. But of course, the convener is not the only way you get to the ministry if you wanted to. The convener has a two-way role. It's both to connect you to the minister with your concerns, but also to keep the public sector accountable for, just a second, things do need to change here. And I know you're distracted on something else, which is terribly important, but this is important too. And so it is a role which is a bit like the role when I do lead these reviews. It just continues. And you would certainly, I would imagine that person is going to need a fairly high level of contact. Now, what the advice I would give banks in this is, by the way, the flexibility around that convener is designed so that for some things, it'll be the CEOs of the banks that are required and fintechs. For other things, it'll be operational people. So please don't have in mind that it is any one individual that might, or just a couple that might be required. The flexibility around the convener is designed so the people who are needed can be called upon for that particular task. And the reason for that is too many times at these meetings of other bodies, you can end up with the wrong person at the meeting. That could have been sorted in the invitation and not during the meeting itself.
Okay, that's interesting. So the convener is more of a construct of advisors that are relevant to what's under discussion as opposed to one individual. Excellent. Okay, good. We've already clarified something with first question off the bat. Great. Moving on. Okay, so let's talk about powers of designation now, because we're still with the Treasurer. The report's recommended that the Treasurer have a more broad scope to designate constructs into becoming a payment system, so other regulators can then do what they do with that. And the RBA also has a little bit more leeway in what they can use to assess a system for regulation. Do you think that this has implications for buy now, pay later and crypto?
It has implications for everything.
Yes.
So go back to my original statement in relation to functional definition. So we don't know what will. I couldn't possibly draft for you a definition of payment system which will encapsulate the transfers of value that you and I might be doing in 7.5 years' time. Also, the systemic designation power is designed to make sure also that issues which affect Australians of all types, but are not through a business model which has anyone physically here, can still somehow be brought into the policy decisions of the Australian government. So things shouldn't be in something like payments, which is utterly fundamental to our economy. Payments for Australians shouldn't be beyond the power of our Australian government to impose regulation to protect Australians if required, just because a lawyer couldn't draft the wording right. Now, that's obviously not going to be perfect because we have a practical function around how the heck do we enforce against people overseas. But that's also a question as to the protection for the businesses that are already subject to our regulatory regime, because there's also, one of the most common comments I got from all sorts of businesses is that there's a free rider issue here, where we're complying with regulation, but others aren't, and they're getting an unfair advantage. And that comes from small businesses, startups, and fintechs as well, right? So that's not just banks saying that at all. So going back to your question, new payment methods or ways of making payments, that could include the two you mentioned, but that's not my gig to make that decision. This is a mechanism for bringing them into the loop if it is needed to. Now, that mechanism needs to be consulted. Every time the mechanism is used, needs to be consulted on, and we have to have a reason for doing it. But it is designed to catch new business models, new technologies, new players. Where it is needed, it is a very strong power to use, and we've rarely used the current one of the Reserve Bank, but the absence of the power, given other countries have it, just doesn't seem right. I couldn't think of a reason why something that affects payments should actually be beyond the power of the Australian government to regulate if required.
And that would then mean that this is the mechanism that could potentially be used to bring Apple Pay under that umbrella. And remove it from an ACCC concern into more of a, well, actually, this is a payment system concern, and here's the tools that we can use to do that. Is that right?
It is a tool. It is a tool that can be used for all sorts of technological. Right. I'm obviously not. I'm desperately trying not to say the actual names of these things.
I know. So, I don't. I don't have any plans.
You're right. But I keep coming back to the point of, and the next one. And the next one, and the next one.
That's right.
Because there are plenty of things that I see happening in other parts of the world where when that comes to Australia, I'm not really quite sure how that fits in, and we'll need it to fit in some way. The designation power could also be, actually, we don't have a problem with this just yet. But
that's true. Yep.
Keep in mind that we could have a problem, and so don't imagine that you're beyond the reach of the people who protect Australians. They just don't need protecting right now.
And you say problem, but I do think that in many circumstances, this could be a gift to some communities like the crypto community who are actively looking for some sort of regulation to bring them into the mainstream so that people can interact with them in a safe and comfortable way. So I think that that's a really powerful thing. But just carrying with that theme for a minute, so you recommended the RBA have more scope and Philip Lowe's gone on record to talk about services, not systems, when it comes to payments, which I think is a positive thing. But do you think, given how you've said that the RBA has flexed this muscle before, do you think that they have the right mentality embedded in the RBA to actually use this to support and encourage innovation? Is innovation in the RBA's DNA? Do you think that might be a blocker more than an enabler of innovation? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think that they perform their mandate very well, but you need to look at their mandate and very careful in the review to describe what their legislation allows them to look at. And they've been around, 60 years now, 62 years, something like that. And that's what they're built to do: stability, efficiency, competition. The reason for the new designation power is I don't really want the captain playing out of position. They're pretty good, and they are the captain of the regulated team. Basically, they payments best. But you shouldn't be asking them to play out of position in relation to this. So that's why their designation power is not, I didn't recommend to be removed, but the Treasurer's power is all-encompassing as well. So, for example, if the RBA did not feel comfortable in exercising its power in relation to something, most likely that could be because on its own, it's just not enough. But actually, with all those other things you're considering, Treasurer, it would be, then it could be done. And then the choice of regulator is a choice for the Treasurer. And it could be more than one, in the sense of actually the stability aspects of this, could you look after those, the RBA? There's some other aspects actually that we think ASIC is better to look after. And so it introduces that flexibility to do that. So, and I suppose this is I got quizzed a number of times as to why don't we have a single regulator? So you wouldn't throw away this skill set combination, because actually in some of the challenges we have in the future, I wouldn't back any single organisation to be able to solve all these problems. But 5 plus the Treasury, that's 5 different perspectives. I don't know it doesn't really matter what you think about their ability to go outside their box. At least they know their stuff about their own turf. So that's why I think it's really important not to make them move beyond their position, but we have to make sure that the game isn't lost because they're stuck in their positions. And that's the role for the broader power.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, let's move on from designation and have a look at your recommendation around a single licensing structure. I love the structure that you've presented. It actually tracks really well with a fintech's journey, starting small, being able to design new services, iterate them quickly, and then move progressively through that licensing framework to reach the end goal for some, which will be the ADI, or it might be somewhere in the middle with one of those licensing constructs that really serve their purpose well. ASIC sits under that. They're getting better, but they don't have the best reputation of being very quick, very supportive, very transparent with recommendations and advice on where and how to apply for things, and whether you need to or not for that matter, even though there's obviously going to be a simplified framework. Do you think that they're going to have a bit of work ahead of them to actually be able to be the ones that are administering this new licensing framework? Have you given them a hard task that's maybe out of their reach now?
You can't ask me those 2 questions and expect the same. so that's
answer that how you will.
Question.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, they've got a lot of work to do. Not as much as Treasury have. Treasury's got a huge amount of work to do, partly also to make sure that all the regulators do get up the curve to be able to provide that. That is both the outward facing part around the information and accessibility of that information, the clarity that payments regulators in other countries do provide. And by the way, ASIC is not necessarily the worst at providing clarity in relation to its policy positions in the payments area, but you can see some other countries where there are documents, sometimes very long, saying, here is our view. This is good, this is bad, we're done now. That takes courage, but it also facilitates an awful lot of investment in business and jobs and all those important things, because it's very difficult to understand otherwise. Am I relying on, is the structure relying on ASIC to do it alone? No, Treasury has to be there too to say, just a second, this is not fitting in with what APRA said. It's got to. And that's why the coach has got a very, very busy job. But none of the recommendations really will work if all the regulators just stay exactly as they are. Yeah. That is not the idea. So, like at least my first review, both the public and the private sector need to both walk and chew gum to make this work. I don't make any apologies for that, because we kind of need to run and chew gum given how fast things are moving anyway.
Yeah, and look, I think to be fair on ASIC, they are making some significant strides forward in improving their service times with sandboxes and responding to applications quickly. So I think they're pointed in the right direction, but they obviously need a little bit of extra wheat bix to get them through to see this licensing regime through. My other favourite recommendation is number 11, which says, I'm going to read this so I get it right. The single payments licensing framework should facilitate transparent access to the payment systems. This is something that's near and dear to the hearts of many, many fintechs. But do you think in practice, it will mean that if you hold one of these new license structures, do you have a settlement account with the RBA and therefore are completely self-sufficient? Or do you still require sponsorship from a bank to participate in the system? And then thinking through, that's the sticking point that we're having today as payment companies in the space. Do you think that banks will be compelled to provide access to these license holders if that's one of the ways to access? I guess unpacking that a little bit further before you answer. There's a part in the report that talks about payment initiation on CDR being instruction services. And therefore, that's not something that you would necessarily need a payments license to do, because you're not moving funds. You're providing instructions to others to move funds. And I think that's quite clever because we've already got Pay2 with the MPP. And I know that the MPP has advocated for such a licensing framework for some time, but Pay2 was able to sit above that. And you can become a connected institution and have full access and create these messaging services. But that's not necessarily what all payment companies want to do. They need access to the funds movement part. So are we still relying on banks for that is the ultimate question. And will we have a lever that we can pull to say, hey, I've got this amazing license. Here it is. Please, I'd like my access now.
Yes, so yes. So the idea, it's a bit like every single review I do tonight. The idea here is, right, well, we need to expose the competitive choice that people are making. And there's some sort of obscurity here in relation to, you need to do this in order to be a member of this system. And it's often packaged into a license requirement, which is nothing. Some part of it is to the payment system. Another part, it was just convenient to refer to that. So if you adhere to the requirements which would be applicable to the large new payments license, which you could do even if you have a small one, then it'll become apparent to the Reserve Bank and the ACCC that, well, any reason that you are not now allowed to join is not because of safety and stability. So we're going to need to examine how competitive, what is driving this choice. I'm not making the choice of whether that's good or bad. Different payment systems could have different reasons for doing it, but the discussion should be around those reasons. It should be around, is that a legitimate basis for not allowing someone to join? Because these things are now taken completely off the table. And I think your question around the ESA is an interesting one, and clearly there are pathways for doing that in the United Kingdom. And that will be something that I'm sure, if the recommendation is accepted, the Reserve Bank will take into account in setting these standards themselves. One thing they are good at is actually making sure that the rules that they require are actually adhered to by themselves as well. So the answer to the question is no, it's not a free pass. because there still could be other reasons that, and I don't know what they are, but I would like to take off the table some of the reasons which clearly could be satisfied by a regulatory regime, so that the conversation about why I can't join is on its merits rather than on other things. And right. I think we could end up in the point area where you've described, but I actually think there could be some competitiveness around the payment systems themselves as well, in relation to the way what they are looking for, particularly in relation to the services that they offer. And I'm also a bit cautious around, if you start to add data-related services to that, and some don't, do you need other requirements as well? So it was designed to be a significant step in that direction, to unbundle those requirements so you could clearly meet some of them, and then to create a clear conversation for the parties and regulators to test that if it's not working properly.
And I think that bringing AUSTRAC more into the stream of there are requirements there to be met as well for these licenses, that actually removes one of the biggest points of opaque argument that banks do present for not providing access to payment systems. So I get that. And I do understand that there's nothing anywhere that says banks have to bank someone, whether or not they hold a magic piece of paper or not. But I do think that this will go to help, and it's that smaller end of town that those new players that are potentially coming in at that first step on the licensing framework, they're going to need the most help and assistance, because they're creating the new, amazing, innovative, creative companies of the future. And if we don't support them at the beginning, we won't have them at the end. So hopefully the licensing framework plays out the way that you've recommended to help support those. Okay.
And that point around the alignment of AUSTRAC requirements is critical. That's actually probably one of the biggest benefits, if it gets implemented properly, is and I've got a section at the back that talks about debanking, is there, because of the complexity of payments, there is a lot of obscurity in understanding the reason why decisions have to be made. One of the first steps a regulatory regime can take is, let's get rid of that obscurity so we really know why this has been made. And if that is a bad policy outcome, Treasury, your job is to fix it, because it can't be the case that anything that the government wants to fix is beyond its power. So it really is trying to shine a light on so many things where jargon or bundling in regulation is actually, it needs to be disrupted. And it's kind of a fintech approach is, let's unbundle that so that we can actually see which parts of this are subsidizing other parts. And you've already identified two areas where there's regulatory subsidization going on.
So speaking of AUSTRAC, they're probably the regulator with the most well-used fine book that we've certainly seen in the news. They get some good headlines, AUSTRAC. So they issue fines for breaches. When you're thinking about the e-payments code coming into being something that is regulated and mandated, do you think that the consequences for not adhering to the e-payments code guidelines, whenever they're actually reviewed and created to be appropriate and match this new regulatory playing field we're going into, do you think that there will be consequences for not following the codes? Are they going to match an AUSTRAC style fine system? Will anyone wield the power to remove a license if there's repeated offences?
I think that that will mainly be an ASIC issue, because they're the one issuing license on that. And I think a number of your members would already know the way ASIC deals with breaches in relation to AFSLs. And I don't think there's any reason to say that breaches of the e-payments code will be treated like breaches of our international FATF requirements. It's not on the same policy scale in relation to that, and I should imagine that ASIC would take a consistent approach to what it normally does in that regard. If you look at the way that people often get redress for breaches of the e-payments code is you get your money back. And, you know, quite frankly, that happens a lot, whether or not the e-payments code is actually triggered, for example. I should imagine that that's more likely to be the response as to this person has lost their money and it was your fault. Give them their money back,
Give them back.
As opposed to a big fine, for example. So I would be focusing as who is the regulator that's going to be doing, and I think that regulator will be ASIC. Now, what are they going to do? Well, I don't think putting fines on fintechs that wipe them out of existence is actually going to help the customers that ASIC is trying to protect.
Excellent. Okay, good. All right, moving on from fines, but still sticking on these same lines. There's a table in the report, table it's 4.1, page 56 for those playing at home. And it shows, it's a beautiful representation of some of the reasons that the Treasurer might use to designate a system into being a regulated payment system. One of them, which is really interesting, is crisis management. And thinking about a crisis, it's meant to be a period of time. It'd be horrible to think that the crisis was on forever. Does that mean that the Treasurer will also have power to de-designate or undesignate a payment system, which would be almost like a little small-scale deregulation? Is that something that the Treasurer will be able to do in the scope of your recommendations?
I think the draftsperson would be entirely acting properly and allowing designations to be amended, and an amendment to designation could withdraw its effect.
That would be really interesting. I think a dynamic to you know, have a moment in time where something is falling under the purview of a particular regulator, and then that ends and it goes back to being just interesting. And it was just something that stuck out to me as an interesting thing.
It was done in 2008. There are a number of emergency orders made to really protect even a few weeks, and then they were withdrawn. So I couldn't imagine a reason for not allowing that to occur, partly because we could get a technological change that says we don't need to do that anymore. Yeah, so let's just take it away. And probably it certainly would happen in crisis management. I think it would be wise to allow it to be removed. It could happen in other areas too, where you think, oh, that tool was too blunt. We need to change that tool. At the time, we thought it was an issue. Actually, it wasn't an issue. So we need to be able to change that. In fact, if we didn't allow that power, we get stuck where we are now. Like from 20 years ago, we'd be all locked in. So I think it's a really good point. I didn't. Next time I speak to Treasury, I think actually when you draft this, maybe you want to make sure about that. But normally we would give the government the power to amend its orders, and that should include the power to withdraw them.
Okay, excellent, thank you. All right, I have one more question on my list, and then I'll just go and grab some out of the Q&A stream because we've got a few more minutes left. Of the 15 recommendations that you've put into the report, and I think each one dovetails nicely into the other, so it's a nice rounded set of recommendations. Which do you think will be the biggest challenge for Treasury to swallow if they're going to take all your recommendations and run for them? Which will be the hardest one for them to act upon? And then just moving across to a different stakeholder for a moment, which do you think will present the biggest challenge to our banks as far as something that they now have to contend with as a mechanism?
I think it's the same answer.
Okay.
It is the Treasury function itself. It is the fact that what that means is the idea that some people have that self-regulation should take the place of any government oversight. That's not feasible at a policy level when things are changing so much. It is feasible at a standards level with the right oversight, but not at a policy level. It's also the hardest thing to do. And so that requires that the Treasury function wins the trust of everyone, as well as has the competency and courage to say things like, I don't know. Who does know? and you recall, you would know this, Simone, I say that a lot in these consultations because there's lots of stuff I don't know. That whole philosophy that they take to be the coach and not the referee, the coach is going to be hard. It's essential. Canada's coach is pretty good, quite frankly. Their team has a lot of expertise in Treasury, in Finance Canada. That's going to be hard to relinquish. And I think that some of our larger institutions might say, well, we're relinquishing authority over how the system works. No, you've got to join the team. That's probably the most fundamental thing under here is the biggest change is not even a recommendation. It's the result of all of them, which means that it's not us and them anymore. It is an ecosystem which we're all in together. And it's terribly old-fashioned to just refer to the regulators and business. You need both of them here. And that is quite a change from the last 10 years as we've interacted with the regulators. It's not a change from 2008 when we did snap back into, oh my goodness, we need to work together. We don't have a crisis to make us do it this time, but were a crisis to happen, we won't have time to move. So we have to set it up in advance. That's going to be hard. I think Treasury are up for it, but like everyone else in this process, they're kind of going to have to work together to get it to happen. And we certainly need it to happen for this to work well.
You know, it is so fascinating what is happening in payments, and what you said at the beginning of this session about payments are hard, but they shouldn't be hard for the people that consume them. I don't think they know what interest they're missing out on by not knowing what's going on behind the scenes. Anyway, so let's have a quick look at these questions. So Katie from Neum, okay, this one's about timeline. What do you think the time frame on this is going to be? And I know that you won't have a good read on this, but you might have some concept of how long are we looking at before all this comes out? Is it BAU in the meantime? Will there be a grandfathering of any, RADIs, for example, that are issued in the meantime? How do you think that this is going to suddenly merge into where we are now? And how long until we get to where we're going?
So this is my personal view because the government is still marking my homework. And I would encourage Fintech Australia to give their honest comments to government about that. But there has been an awful lot of enthusiasm from both public and private sector in relation to the need for the review and the consequences of it. So I don't think it's going to be left on the table. The recommendations can take place in different timelines. They don't have to all happen at once. And indeed, some recommendations start to take effect as soon as they are announced. For example, were the Treasury to announce that this is going to happen and the designation power would be given, then conduct will change because it becomes inevitable that this is going to happen. So the influence over regulators would change straight away potentially as well. In other words, the coach has said, I'm coming to the field now. Other things which actually requires the change of law to have the desired effect. For example, the operational context of payments licensing, that will take longer. What you've identified is absolutely critical. The grandfathering of issues and licenses and authorizations is very important. This is not designed to be something that has to happen over the weekend because we're in a disaster. We don't want to create a disaster by actually forcing thousands of people to get new licenses. So in a way, I think we should be moving quickly to start the implementation path, but we should be making sure that the implementation path doesn't create problems for us. And I think an ordering of that would be quite wise. However, parts of this could happen sooner than you think.
Okay, that's encouraging and enigmatic at the same time. Okay. So John Ryan from Emerging Payments, very topical for emerging payments. How do you think your report and the recommendations will work towards improving cross-border payments? I feel like overall, any payments that are happening in Australia will have an uplift because everyone's going to be rowing in the same direction, working towards the strategy that will be identified. But do you think there's anything in particular that will help with cross-border payments in particular?
I think the best thing that it will do for cross-border payments is make someone in charge of the impact that cross-border payments have for Australians and the relationship Australia has with others. That is, and I don't just mean a regulatory impact. I mean, for example, in imposing this regulation, we have now meant that these sorts of cross-border payments are nearly impossible for these people to do. Is that what we wanted to do as a country? And so that, I think in cross-border payments, there are a lot of unintended effects because not all the customers are in your jurisdiction. And so you can choose to ignore them. The other part is there clearly is increasing real connectivity between relevant countries, the people doing it, and I mean beyond the normal frameworks that we put in place that are slightly more bureaucratic. However, cross-border transfers of data are hard, money is just data, cross-border transfers of money are hard, and in fact, that's one of the key areas why we need to get the players more match fit, because I don't think we're ready for that game yet.
With all this talk about coaches, I don't know if you've seen a show called Ted Lasso. It's on Apple TV. It's a delightful show if you feel like a little escape and a feel-good moment. But I keep thinking now of Josh Reichenberg with a mustache and a visor as the coach.
What did you
visual.
I'm not going to.
I will not. It's a compliment more than anything. Okay, last question, and this is more of a process question from Jennifer Harrison. You've had a lot of PDF documents coming at you with a lot of info. Did you find a genius tech solution to help collate all that across a large team? Nothing to do with payments, just a process question.
No, I read every single submission that's given to me when I lead a review, because I take the view that you wrote it, I'm going to read it. And Fintech Australia in particular, I read again. My copy of your submissions has got highlighting all over it. The reason I do that is because I need to make sure I've applied my own mind to every point that you've made. Of course, Treasury do it as well, and they have all sorts of systems to do it. But I've got to be able to tell you, Simone, yeah, I read it, and again and again. I may not have agreed with all of it, but you wrote it, so I read it. And I'm not trying to make a point about the use of technology, but even as a lawyer, which I actually do have a job as a lawyer sometimes, I have to make sure that you end up reading every word, because some of the meaning is critical. So sorry, no. I know the kind of technology you use. This is too important. I just have to be able to tell you, yeah, I read your stuff. Thank you for taking the time to write it.
Well, thank you for taking the time to read it. We do appreciate it, because we do put a lot of time and effort into it and try to represent everyone's views equally. And look at that, bang on 11. We've done it. Thank you, Scott. I really appreciate your time. And I know that the members on the call today really appreciate your time. Beck, did you want to say any last words before we dial off? Or Scott, did you have anything to say?
I just wanted to thank you both for today's conversation, and also remind members we do have an exclusive opportunity to talk with Minister Jane Hume on Monday. If you haven't registered, please register for that. And for those that haven't registered for the Finnies will be held virtually on October 13. And thank you, Scott, and thank you, Simone, again for today's wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.